Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Frank Wisner, and I have been asked, a great honor indeed, to organize the panel for a discussion this morning. Rather than take any more time and lose the valuable time available to us, I suggest we settle down and begin our discussion. We have 4 speakers this morning. They will speak in the order set out in your program on page 2. Qamar Al-Huda will lead. Suzanne Maloney will follow, both to discuss the internal dynamics in Iran and how those dynamics affect the policy considerations that we as Americans, that the new administration will have to take on board as we proceed to design our relationships with Iran. Avner Cohen will be with us, apparently several minutes late, and Bill Lewis will wrap up the presentation. I hope that we will have a good 15 to 20 minutes so that I can take your questions on board and perhaps, if they're organizing themes, sum those up at the end of the morning's events. But let me welcome all of you on what is a terrific occasion, a subject that will be of enormous importance to all of us, Iran, how to deal with this troubled, complex relationship. And with that as an opening introduction, Qamar Al-Huda, would you take over? You can either speak from the podium or you can speak sitting down. Good.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My talk will specifically deal with the Iranian clergy and my encounters with the Grand Ayatollahs and particularly certain clergies who I think are important names, reformers, conservatives, pro-Western, and also names that we should know. I traveled to Iran last year. I will be traveling there shortly. And one of the things I noticed immediately is how we as Americans have a clear disadvantage of understanding Iran's clergy class and its influence in understanding most basic things, not just realpolitik, regional politics, ethics, war, but almost on every level we don't understand or think about the influence of the clergy in their own assessment and mapping of world affairs. Just traveling to Iran, one notices on the airplane the number of Europeans and Asians traveling to Iran on a daily basis. That's just a footnote. But I do want to just say that since when we do assess nations and bilateral relations, the religion and religious leaders are usually not on the first 3 or 4 items to discuss or analyze. But with the case of Iran, the religious leaders are in track 1, track 2, and every other track. And it's important to understand the diversity of religious leaders, the diversity of thought, the internal debate, the sporadic skirmishes, theological as well as sometimes physical, and also understand the sort of historical importance of these different debates. There are basically, because of time, I'm just going to mention 3 very important names. I think American policymakers, Americans, and generally academics and scholars should know because of their influence in domestic politics and regional politics. The first, of course, is this Montazeri, who is one of Khomeini's colleague, and he was appointed to high levels as the Committee on Experts on the Supreme Council, and one of an important thinker who was very much interested in advocating a political activist Shi'i Islam. The second Grand Ayatollah Musavi, Ardabili Musavi, and the third is Karimi. The reason I picked these 3 is because we happened to not only meet these different individuals on our trip last year, but we hope to continue with our meetings but also I think they reflect a great deal of diversity and internal debate. One of the reasons my team at USIP went to Iran was to explore the sort of non-dominant rhetoric internally on how they view themselves, how they assess conflict and war, how do they understand their neighbors, and of course Americans and American Muslims. We found out quickly that there was no consensus. We found out quickly there was more internal debate than we imagined. We found out very quickly that there was a very strong culture of mocking the current president at every level, not just at the Grand Ayatollah level, but at the level of seminary students, professors, human rights activists, and so forth. So, because I think what the image we see and what's manufactured is this one president speaks for the entire nation, and there's in total agreement with his ideas. A few words on Ayatollah Montazeri. As of now, he's under house arrest, and he's almost still a leading thinker. He was arrested in 1997 by the supreme leader himself, who arrested him and told him he can no longer have access to public, but he has over thousands and thousands of students, seminarians, authors, human rights, as well as feminists, progressives, and others who think that he has some interesting ideas. And he has made an entire 180-degree shift from being a part of the Khomeini's regime, being part of the assembly of the experts, for supporting the idea that there's a Wali Faqih, a figure that the religious scholars must govern the state. He has said publicly in the 90s that there's no need for a theocracy. The religious scholars do not need to lead. The religious leaders should not have and direct the destiny of the state. He said publicly that there have been major political and theological, philosophical problems with Iran since the revolution. He's retracted his statements in support of Khomeini. He's also retracted his statements about political authority by the religious leaders. Since those statements, he was arrested, and even then, he has, in a sense, created a ripple effect of thinking about politics, political philosophy, involvement, activism, and relationships with neighbors and the West. So for 9 years, he was responsible for the academic and personal being of foreign students, and he also has, his influences just Iranian students, but Arab seminarians, and Afghan, Pakistani, South Asian seminarians, Central Asian and Southeast Asians. He was part of the Revolutionary Council, and he was also part of many other Supreme Leader positions that supported the Supreme Leader. His house arrest has caused a great deal of others to think about the need of reshifting Shi'i activism, rethinking the idea of preparing the state for a holy moment or for the holy Messiah, and really questioning the authority of apocalyptic Shi'i theology, which has basically been dominant for about 40 years. I will turn to Ardabili, Grand Ayatollah Ardabili, who was designated as the head of the Supreme Court under Khomeini. He was also a major jurist afterwards, very common to come on TV to give his positions on certain issues. And the reason I pick him is because one would think that from the 80s, his time from 1981 to 1991 as the chief of the justice, that one would see him as a very conservative person. But when we met him and interviewed him, we found out he was more than just this figure in history books, who's written, thank you, dozens of books on jurisprudence, but he advocated for women's rights. He advocated for minority rights, advocated for those who are not believers. He called them non-believers, or believers who don't know, is the exact quote. He advocated for students particularly students, seminary students, to study other than theology, to study the sciences. He has set up his own university that it does the same, this very thing, where he has a liberal arts college. He calls it the first liberal arts college in Iran, and it's based in Qom, the Center of Religious Studies. Another figure I think that's very important in terms of policy is Grand Ayatollah Karimi, who is very conservative and probably not as conservative as another figure called Mesbah Yazdi. But the point is, I bring these two figures up at the end because they still are probably the same rhetoric from 1979, 1980, 1982, and some of the rhetoric we hear today of anti-Western, anti-Zionist, and so forth. Imperial West is bound to destroy all of Iran or other states. But what's important to them is the way that, they're interested in still opening relations. You ask them questions about war, about Iraq, what would it take to prevent a war. They said we have to do as much as possible for preventing war. We have to have more dialogue. They speak about diplomatic channels. They speak about track 2, of course. They talk about military channels. I think what I wanted to say is that these last two figures, Mesbah Yazdi and Karimi, while their rhetoric is the things we hear, in closed doors they do want relations. In closed doors they do want to find a way for diplomatic relations. And I think even if that doesn't translate in policy or in foreign policy of Iran, it is transferring into their seminary students, the thousands of supporters, and also the influence it has in the human rights group. I have 1 more minute left, but one person that cannot be dismissed is the Grand Ayatollah Sana'i, who's very important. And all of these Grand Ayatollahs have websites, websites in about 5-6 languages. Sana'i is the most important, I think, for progressives, human rights groups, to feminist groups, to reformers. All turn to the Grand Ayatollah Sana'i for supporting and using religious authority for progressive Iran. For human rights, for reforming education, for women's rights, etc. I'll stop there, but the point being, I think that the clergy class not only has to be more understood, but has to be engaged, and I think would be a very important way to opening diplomatic channels. Thank you.
Suzanne.
Thank you, Ambassador Wisner, and thank you to the U.S. Institute of Peace. The mic's not on. I was going to apologize for giving this talk while seated, because the only thing more daunting than trying to talk about Iranian politics in 10 to 12 minutes or less is trying to do it when you're 9.5 months pregnant. But in any case, I won't apologize, at least not until I lose my breath, which should happen relatively soon. But let me just say, I think we're at a moment that is sort of a watershed for U.S.-Iranian relations, and I'm going to try to relate what I have to say about the domestic scene to this larger framework for engagement that I think we are at least poised on the verge of. That is, here in Washington, the debate that we've had over the past 8 years about whether or not to engage is effectively over by virtue of the election of a presidential candidate who, in fact, favored engagement early on in the campaign and with some degree of consistency throughout the campaign. I think in any effect, the debate that we've had over the past 8 years in Washington about whether or not to engage was a bit of a false one. Because, of course, President Bush, the current President Bush, as well as his predecessor, every one of his predecessors has engaged or attempted to engage directly with the Iranian regime over the past 30 years. This has been one of the few consistent elements of U.S. policy toward Iran. And so this discussion, which I think peaked particularly between 2003 and 2006, about whether or not we legitimize the regime by talking to them, was a bit of a false one, because of course the Bush administration talked to Iran directly between 2001 and 2003 on the question of Afghanistan, and once again starting in 2007 over the past 2 years over Iraq. But what is interesting, of course, is that we have the inauguration of a new administration prepared to engage directly with the Iranians at a time when the Iranians, for the first time in their post-revolutionary history, appear to be at least open to the idea of talking directly to Washington. What has been the fundamental obstacle to any real progress in dealing with the Iranians directly over the past 30 years has been their unwillingness to talk to us. But since 2006, at least, there is a public, for the first time, a public, authoritative, across the political spectrum, commitment to talking to the U.S. It first was expressed in the terms of a willingness to dialogue on Iraq, but very clearly over the past 2 years, this has been repeated, reiterated, and we are in this kind of a watershed moment. So as a result, we know what the policy generally from 50,000 feet will be with respect to the U.S. toward Iran. We know the direction, we don't know the details. And there are obviously a few things that are going to help us with this policy, particularly the falling price of oil, the diplomatic honeymoon that the new administration should face. But there are going to be enormous challenges, and obviously one of those challenges is being discussed in one of the other rooms here today, the situation in Gaza, but as well a number of other issues across the region. I would say that ultimately the biggest challenge for dealing with Iran is the one where our information is the least substantial and where our influence is almost non-existent. And that is Iran's unpredictable and infinitely complicated domestic scene. With some consistency, the U.S. policy community has misread or simply missed every major twist and turn in Iran's post-revolutionary history, starting with the failure to anticipate the revolution, but really at every point of critical changes in Iran leading up to the 2005 election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which we did not predict or anticipate. This reflects, to some extent, the unpredictability of Iran's semi-authoritarian system of rule, but it also speaks to our own shortcomings in being able to interpret Iran from a distance. From the hostage crisis to Iran-Contra, to the various missed opportunities of the Clinton and Bush administrations, every prior American effort to resolve its antagonistic relationship with Iran has been undermined by this lack of familiarity with Iran's internal political dynamics and how those dynamics impact Iran's strategic calculations. So if any new diplomatic initiative is going to be successful in tempering Iran's policies, in dealing with our major challenges, the nuclear program, Iran's effort to extend its influence across the region, any new diplomatic initiative must incorporate a keener interpretation of the implications of Iran's ever-changing internal dynamics and strategies that enable Washington to navigate those prospective pitfalls more effectively. Because our time is limited, and is my breath, let me just try to make 5 general points about Iran's domestic politics that I think are relevant for U.S. policymakers in terms of trying to maximize the prospects that we can be successful this time around. First is that, as I began to say before, we know that Iran can, in fact, come to the table. Iran can say yes to negotiations for the first time in its post-revolutionary history. But I'd say we don't know what Iran specifically can say yes to. We know that if we look at Iranian policy over the past 30 years, Tehran has in fact reversed its policies on a number of issues, whether it was the decision to accept a ceasefire with Iraq after pledging to continue the war until the annihilation of the Ba'athist regime, whether it was the decision to reverse internal policies such as family planning issues, which there was an effective U-turn on during the 1980s. Iran has also been proven to be capable of embracing old adversaries. The relationship today with the government of Saudi Arabia is entirely transformed from the relationship that existed for the first 10 to 15 years after the revolution. Although it's still tense, it's nowhere near the sort of relationship that left Ayatollah Khomeini in a position to write in his final will and testament any number of epithets about the Saudi regime. There's a great deal of at least workable cooperation between the two governments today. We also know that Iran can, in fact, engage in selective, constructive dialogue with the United States. In particular, this experience in the Geneva and Bonn discussions between 2001 and 2003 on Afghanistan has been said by participants on both sides to have been a viable, constructive dialogue. It was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There were a lot of frustrations, meetings canceled over unfulfilled promises, and yet it did produce cooperation, it did produce results on the ground in Afghanistan, both in terms of strategic cooperation, in terms of U.S. Operation Enduring Freedom, but also in terms of the establishment of the post-Taliban government in Afghanistan. We know that there is cross-factional support for a direct dialogue with Washington. I've been stunned, frankly, in meeting people, whether it's Iranian parliamentarians, clerics, others, really beyond the sort of normal interlocutors that Americans have opportunities to talk to, who are in fact very direct and open and unashamed of embracing policies that, at least as recently as 2002, would have gotten one arrested for expressing publicly in Tehran, which is willingness and readiness to talk directly to the United States. But what we don't know, and I think we can't know until we test, is whether the Iranian regime is capable of making the sort of epic concessions that would be necessary to really changing the relationship between Washington and Tehran. And even more uncertain is whether Iran has or will ever attain the level of policy coordination and institutional coherence that would be necessary to really have an overarching grand bargain, as people have talked about. So that's the first point about Iranian domestic politics. Let me speak quickly to several others. One is we need to understand the dominant mindset today in Tehran. This is a sense that strength is power. Iranian leaders, particularly hardliners, view assertiveness as equivalent to or an effective substitute for power. It's a kind of Hobbesian worldview that ingrains an aversion to compromise, and you see it in the nuclear diplomacy. You see it in the sorts of things that President Ahmadinejad has said over the years, along the lines of, today they're looking to us to cede our nuclear rights. Tomorrow they'll be pressing us on human rights. The next day it will be animal rights. Iranian leaders widely perceive that any beginning concession on their side will only lead to further pressure. And I think we're never going to succeed in getting them to make those concessions unless we are able to create a situation in which they understand there are going to be incentives for cooperation as well as further demands put upon them. One point about the timing with respect to any sort of engagement and how it plays out with respect to Iran's internal politics. There's already a discussion about whether or not we talk to the Iranians or launch any overture in advance of their elections, which are to take place in June 2009. I think there's a laudable desire to avoid boosting Ahmadinejad's prospects at home, but the presumption that we can tailor our own diplomacy around Iran's notoriously unpredictable elections is somewhat misguided. We have really no capacity to predict or positively influence the outcome. And I think timing any overture to the ballot would risk the perception that we're linking an overture to a change in Iran's leadership, which would effectively taint any successor to Ahmadinejad, even if one were to be elected. And in any case, I think that it's a reasonable bet, and certainly anyone betting on Iranian elections 6 months in advance is bound to lose, even 6 days. But it's a reasonable bet that Ahmadinejad will be in a decent position to get himself another 4-year term, if that's what the political elite would like him to have. Two final points. After getting into a bit of the mechanics of the regime and the personalities, I think we have to be careful to avoid over-Kremlinology when it comes to Iran. I remember back in December 2006, there was a feeling of great excitement around the US government when Ahmadinejad went to a student meeting and several students stood up and burned his picture. There was a sense that the elections for the Assembly of Experts, in which Ahmadinejad's slate appeared to do somewhat poorly, was a real setback for him. And yet we see 2 years later that, in fact, Ahmadinejad remains president. He has, if anything, expanded his influence and expanded his capacity to make policy. We spend a lot of time analyzing who's up, who's down, and it's important to understand the personalities. But we also have to recognize that at every point over the past 30 years, the Iranian regime is engaged in fratricidal partisanship. Even Khomeini was not able to enforce his will. He had to bargain to get his prime minister put in place. So we have to recall that this is a sort of a negotiation within the regime itself, and that will always take place, that there will always be the sort of critiques that we hear, vociferous critiques from within the internal elites against any particular individual who holds the presidency, and we have to be careful not to presume too much from them. And finally, I'd just end with, we need to expect the unexpected when it comes to Iran. If we ever believe we have Iran figured out, we have to think again. Iran's politics routinely defy predictions. We didn't predict Ahmadinejad. We didn't predict his predecessor, Mohammad Khatami, and the reform movement. We didn't predict the revolution, and we're unlikely, sitting here in Washington, to be able to predict what's going to happen next in Iran. Thanks.
non-proliferation policy with enormous amount of problems. It is obvious that the new administration believes, and I think rightly so, that negotiating deal is preferred, at least for the beginning, over confrontation. That's obvious. So it wants to negotiate a political deal that would keep Iran so-called non-nuclear, but non-nuclear, as I'm going to clarify, is a very, very tricky deal. That is to say, we need non-nuclear that will be credible both from political and technical point of view, something that will be ultimately politically acceptable by others, including, for example, Israel, and also to see that by that kind of deal, the Iranian nuclear issue will be resolved. Furthermore, such a deal would probably require to persuade Iran to deal with all sorts of linkages on broad political context, security arrangements with Iran, as well as perhaps nuclear issue vis-a-vis the Middle East as a whole. All this create another layers of complexities. My own view is I think that to suggest, to create, to devise such a deal would be extremely difficult. Not impossible, but nearly impossible. It would certainly require a great deal of political and technical creativity, both on the broad agenda and the nuclear non-proliferation agenda. So what I would like to do in the 10 minutes that I was left is just to try to highlight very briefly 10 points or 8 points, each a minute plus, about those difficulties, why I think it's so difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but I think very, very difficult. I'll start with the example about Japan. We all treat Japan as a non-nuclear weapon state. But in many ways, Japan, this is a political decision. This is a political judgment. This is a political convenience. But in many ways, Japan is a nuclear weapon state, even though it never tested a weapon. It is part of the NPT. Japan is, according to at least a British intelligence report, weeks away from the bombs. Most experts believe it's anywhere from weeks to months away from the bomb. So it's very, very close to the position of bomb in the basement. And that's within the NPT and within certain kind of proliferation that were made between Japan and others, including the United States. But we don't make a big issue out of that because it's convenient for all of us and because we treat Japan as a country that is very much on the line but not crossing the line, and we take its intent to be peaceful in this area, at least for the time being, as long as Japan is in the NPT. Now, coming to the Iranian issue. I think the severity of the Iranian, that's my second point, the severity of the Iranian nuclear problem today is that Iran is already now, and certainly it will take time until the administration will be able to engage Iran on this issue, that is to say mid-2009, Iran is very, very close to where Japan is. The infrastructure is different, there are a lot of differences, but I think Japan, technically it's very close to where Japan is. That means, and that's my third point, that the severity of the room for a solution is the severity of the solution is very high, and the room for solution is very small. There is a tiny room for a good solution, a solution that will be credible, political, and technical, unless Iran would agree to roll back, which I think they would not, because the Iranian point is that we are not going to be discriminated in relation to anybody else. Look at Japan. If Japan is allowed, we are allowed too. And that's the Iranian argument in its own legalese framework, the way they put it. And Iranians love their legalese issues. So I think there is very limited room for a good solution. The solution is going to be credible, political, and technical. I think one area that it will take enormous amount of creativity is to try to operationalize a notion of so-called timely warning. That is to say, that it would give us some time to place firewalls vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear programs. In my judgment, it's not obvious, it's not clear at all, that the current tools that we have within the safeguard system, are enough to create those kind of firewalls. That's another element why I think to create and to produce a solution, negotiated solution, would be so difficult. I'm not sure if we have good devices to create this small landscape with firewalls for this timely warning. So that's my fourth point. Fifth point is Iran's own strategy. As I see it, Iran is trying to remain within the NPT, to push the Japanese case to its limits, but unlike Japan, I think Iran would like to blur the difference between possession and non-possession of nuclear weapons to the point that the world and the rumor would go as if Iran is just about having the bomb or just about having a bomb in the basement without Iran's the need to say so openly and clearly and directly. So I think the Iranians' strategy is very much to undermine the difference and distinction between have and have not, a distinction that Japan is important to keep. The integrity of the NPT structure is at stake. There is a certain paradox here. Virtually any deal in terms of the current system would undermine and possibly unravel the system. Any credible deal must, in my view, probably would be something that would lead to restructure or to reinvent the system as it is. That would be extremely difficult. So I think that the dilemma that we're being left is that virtually every deal, its critique would be able to say that Iran is still extremely dangerously close to the bomb, if not just on the line. So the question is, if any deal is going to be inherently problematic, should we call a slate, or just should be for political reasons accepted? And I think here the dilemma would be very, very difficult. And finally, there is the Israel aspect. Israel is not part of the NPT, is not accepting safeguard on its nuclear installations, and the United States many years ago, 40 years ago, has decided that its own interest is to accept Israel nuclear under what we call opacity. Israel does not declare anything, has not tested, and so forth. Iran would like to push that way. Obviously, we do not want to allow that. So obviously, there would be a need to make a certain kind of distinction. I think also Iran would raise the Israeli card at the end. And I think all this raise very, very difficult challenges and questions for any future negotiations. I'm trying to raise issues. I'm trying to make us to think about it. I'm not offering right now any kind of immediate solutions. Thank you.
Thanks. Good Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the U.S. Institute of Peace for organizing this, and I'm pleased to be on the panel with this far more professional group than I on these subjects. I guess I would like to just preview an article that Tom Pickering and Jim Walsh and I are publishing next week in the New York Review of Books, and I will give you a preview of it while you wait in great anticipation for this marvelous solution to all problems. I agree with much of what has been said, and I must say it's a very professional group. I've got 6 propositions, which I'll try to get through. First, I agree with what you said, that the nuclear enrichment issue is central to how the U.S. deals with Iran. There's not much more time left to get this thing right, and the current zero enrichment and sanctions approach will not succeed in changing Iran's behavior on its nuclear program. If we are unable to find a way to talk with Iran without preconditions on how we in Iran can get some of what each side needs out of this relationship, it is unlikely that we can have a constructive discussion with them on any of the other issues in the region that are of great importance to the United States and, frankly, to Iran. So the continuation of current policies on both sides will not only inhibit our possible working with them on other issues of importance to both countries, but I guess most disturbing is it will lead, this policy leads inevitably and to some type of military conflict, which I believe is completely unacceptable alternative at this stage in our relations with that region. The second proposition is that looking at a nuclear deal, what does it look like? At the outset, we believe that given the failing current policies of sanctions, containment, and isolation of Iran, in order to get them to change their policies on enrichment, that we must accept in principle and in practice with them some level of ongoing enrichment. Of the bad options available to the United States in dealing with this issue, and it has strong resistance in this country, in this city, that you have to find a way to get us and them to talk about what an enrichment program might look like. As far as we're concerned, and we, again, Tom Pickering and myself and Jim made a proposal last year in the New York Review of Books precisely on the issue of what you have to do to deal with it. Our belief is that more effective monitoring and inspections of Iran's nuclear program trumps an unsuccessful policy that results in Iran building many thousands more centrifuges. As we have said, don't build them, they have built thousands. They have now 4,000 centrifuges, or 5, whatever it is, what your call is. And I guess we feel that one trade-off that we must have to make in arranging for their being able to continue to enrich at certain level is extremely intrusive inspections. For us, the inspections issue is becoming critical because we're not stopping the enrichment. And we need to design a strategy which will allow greater enrichment, greater inspections. Our proposal is a multinational consortium on the ground, which we've talked about and you can read about in the New York Review of Books last year. Third proposition, rather than approach Iran as a set of problems, it must be dealt with as a nation, which has enormous power in the region. We up to now have dealt with individual aspects of the Iranian problem with the United States, all of which give us concern. But we must recognize that in the future, Iran's influence will increase, and increase significantly when we withdraw our troops from Iraq. And we have to find a way to affect a relationship with them and with the region that integrates them as much as possible into regional solutions to problems. Fourth, Iraq's stability as the U.S. forces draw down will depend on Iraqi governing groups reaching agreement on a range of internal issues, as we know, on the capacity of the Iraqi forces that are on the ground to maintain some stability, but most particularly it will depend on the willingness of the countries in the region to cooperate on supporting Iraq's peaceful development. The Iraq Study Group report, organized by the USIP of 2006, got it right when it said that the UN, quote, should form a support group to reinforce security and national reconciliations within Iraq, neither of which Iraq can achieve on its own. But most importantly, it must find a way to associate all of the countries on the border of Iraq and those countries otherwise interested in a general consortium, general approach, multilateral approach, over a long-term effort to reach an agreement or a set of agreements defining what each country in the region will do and will not do in order to maintain and build the stability in Iraq. The U.S. and Iran will be working together and have to be compatible in the future of Iraq. There is no way a continued, intense, hostile competition for the hearts and minds of Iraqis is going to work to either advantage, and certainly not to the advantage of Iraq. We don't see how any withdrawal policy in Iraq cannot be done without some agreement on the neighboring powers as what happens next with regard to the power in that country. I have a similar discussion on Afghanistan, which I won't give now because I'm close to being out of my time, Frank, I guess. But Proposition 6, Iran is not an abstract entity which is dealt with on a chessboard. It is a country that has 4,000 years of culture. It has human beings, as was described by the first presenter, all of whom think quite differently. It has a feel, a texture that we have not touched. We don't understand that texture. Virtually none of the people I deal with in the U.S. government or in the academic world have, except those who are Iranian Americans, have any feel for Iran. And unless we have direct contact with that country, we can't begin to calibrate to answer Suzanne's question. We don't know yet what they were willing to do. We don't know because we have not asked directly. We have asked on preconditions. We don't want to talk to clerics, so we ask a non-cleric. Or when we don't like the non-clerics like Ahmadinejad, we prefer to talk to the clerics. But we have to talk to them as they're structured. It's no longer a regime. It's a nation that has to be part of our experience, or else all of our other issues in the region fall apart. We propose very strictly, very specifically, an approach that should be taken by the Obama administration. Early on, probably within the first week, there should begin to give some signals. A flat statement reiterating his position that we will talk to any nation in the world without preconditions. It doesn't have to specifically mention Iran. That would be registered loudly within Tehran. Secondly, some mention of the Algiers Accord, which was in 1981 after the release of the refugees, in which you reaffirm Article 1 of that accord, which says we will not interfere in the internal affairs of Iran, would be heard loud and clear and probably wouldn't even be understood in this country, so there's no danger. And I think that the change of the tone, the term carrots and sticks, for example, suggests that somehow Iran is a donkey and will either beat them into submission or feed them carrots and they'll come around, that they can be bought off or beat off. That's not going to happen. And as long as that's in the head of a speaker, then the Iranians say it's the same old message. We can't talk to these people. We've distrusted them for many, many years, since the time of Mossadegh. And so establishing a new tone is important. We think, secondly, early on, almost right away, they should try to find the U.S. should try to find a way to talk directly, officially, at a middle level to an Iranian, a real live Iranian. And find that Iranian, whether it's in the UN or in Paris, and begin to open dialogues like we did with China and Poland during those years. I myself began, right after the Carter administration came in, I began talking to Cuba. We had formal, informal, private talks, which were never noticed until we established our U.S. interest section in Cuba. This is done, it has precedence, and we shouldn't tell all Americans they don't dare talk to an Iranian wherever they see one. We organized a trip. I know we had preset that Secretary Powell would talk to Foreign Minister Khazai at a summit conference on Iraq. And the organizer of the conference sat two of them together, right next to each other. And the ambassador of Iran was there, watched it. And they sat back to back during almost 3/4 of the dinner without even recognizing that they were sitting next to each other. And then I heard from Secretary Powell later that he was not authorized to talk, so they talked about the weather. I mean, this is ridiculous. We shouldn't continue this. Finally, I guess I'll say one more thing, that once we have established this contact, we begin to take some steps, such as establish some steps we would take, such as releasing maybe the Iranians under siege, under arrest in Iraq, dealing with the terrorist organization MEK in some different way, or announcing we're continuing to treat them as a terrorist group, looking toward talking about increased confidence-building measures in the Persian Gulf to avoid conflict, even renewing our talks in Baghdad with the ambassador. And as I've said, there must be some effort, internationally and regionally, to establish, probably under the UN auspices, a regional conference, forum, institution that will serve as an overarching effort to bring the countries in the region together on how to deal with Iraq and eventually Afghanistan. Anyway, I'm still told to stop, but I appreciate the chance, Frank, to talk a little longer than I was supposed to. Thank you very much.
Bill, you did well too. You gave us a lot to think about. To begin the questions, though, I'd like to go to a core assumption you laid out before us, and that is if the United States does not find a way to address the nuclear issue, we cannot develop a workable dialogue and a problem-solving relationship with Iran on other subjects of vital national importance to us. And with that proposition, let me go to Avner, Suzanne, and to you, Qamar, and ask you if you agree with that proposition.
Well, I think that that accepting Iran with nuclear weapons would be a mistake. I think that.
Can you try and see if one of these mics work?
I think ultimately it would be a will. It will be a battle between a deal that ultimately nobody would be fully satisfied, but it would be a deal that would keep Iran within the NPT, not testing a bomb, and yet it would be Iran that will be very close to capability that some people will be very, very unhappy. I think that kind of deal, one would have to scrutinize very closely to feel whether it's worth having, because it's going to be flawed almost under any circumstances, but hopefully not flawed too much. So it will be a real dilemma. I don't have ahead of time any kind of future how to handle it.
Suzanne?
Is this one working? Or? Okay. I think there's a difference between process and outcome. I think a process that engages a range of different issues, including but not exclusive to the nuclear issue, makes a lot of sense. It's the sort of process that I was part of recommending in a project by the Saban Center at Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations. We suggest a multi-track, non-contingent set of negotiations. The nuclear issue would be obviously one of the most urgent, but frankly, I think one is likely to make more progress in the short term on the issue of perhaps Afghanistan and secondly Iraq and the near region. The issue with the nuclear negotiations is frankly twofold. One, that you have a process that already exists and you have to find a way to incorporate that. And two, there's obviously a different time frame attached to the nuclear question. And one would have to find a way to get that nuclear negotiation underway and ensure that the Iranians do not just perpetuate the negotiations for the sake of talks, that in fact you have some sort of incentives for actually coming to an agreement on the nuclear question in a relatively short period of time, because at a certain stage the negotiations themselves will become irrelevant.
Qamar?
Oh, can you hear me? I'm not sure. What I would add to what's already been said is that what's very interesting when you bring up the nuclear issue is how Iranians respond in sort of in a moral and ethical sense. They don't really respond in policy. And just as Shireen Ebadi, the Nobel Prize winner, as I said in her speech, why are certain nations allowed to have it and why are certain nations pressured not to have it? And I think they're, in their response and their sort of thinking and logical thinking of this issue, they really think in terms of these ethical questions. And so I think we need to also not just sidetrack those ethical questions and also address them with them. And I think that's one way to actually to work out this one particular issue and this process.
We have time for a couple of questions on condition that they're kept very short. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you introduce yourself and stand up?
Wolfgang Danzig, Princeton University. Thank you very much for great presentations. My question goes particularly to Bill and to Suzanne.
If you sit in the corridors of the UN, the 5+1, the whole new sanction issue is coming up. And it has become pretty clear, as somebody said to me recently, that we are at the end of our wisdom with sanctions, except if we enter the notion of sanctions of petroleum, of gasoline, refined petroleum. This brings up an issue which you haven't brought about, and by the way, Bill, I sign everything which you propose. That issue concerns the macro region, let me call it like this, Russia and China, and also India, actually. Where do you see ways to be able to, whatever the US and Iran establishes, find support, or at least not the operation of spoilers, to get going in the right direction? Thank you.
Good. Bill, hold that answer, would you, for a moment? Yesem, you're right here.
Professor Carol Deisinger of, Professor Carol Deisinger of New York University, documentary filmmaker working on something that takes place on the border of Iran and Afghanistan. And my question is, the relationship to you is the relationship of the Republican Guard to these mullahs. And I would love to hear what Bill had to say about Afghanistan, and he omitted from his talk.
Good. Mr. Katwari?
Yeah, Farooq Kathwari. I think Bill Lowers referred to it. It appears, reading from the newspapers, that most of the pressure is from the United States, the European Union or some countries there, and Israel. What about Iran's other neighbors, Russia, the Arabs, Turkey? We never hear about them.
One last question. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Faribuz Frank Fuladi. I'm procurementusa.info. I'm a Persian native. My question addressed to the first gentleman who saw the Ayatollahs. It's a cultural issue. In order for Iran and US to engage, there should be saving the face for Iranians, because they have been saying so many things about America, how what evil it is. What kind of saving the face they can do in order to make this transaction happen? And I think that is what Ayatollahs could give him a good idea. Thank you.
Good. I wish we could take more. Let's see if we can have quick answers. Bill, why don't you start?
On China and Russia, again, I have to go back to our proposal, which was to create a multinational consortium on the ground which would give international control and observations over their program. And I have talked to a senior Chinese official on that in Beijing, and they find it extremely interesting. They obviously don't want to go any further on the sanctions route. And as far as I can see, they would like some other alternative approach. They're less concerned about the issue of a multinational control than people in this country. Russia has its own set of issues, including the fact that if there's going to be a consortium, they'd like to run it in Russia. They'd like to have it either in Russia best or possibly dealing bilaterally. With regard to Afghanistan, my sense is that from the very beginning, as Suzanne said, our relationship with Iran was positive. Then we cut them off as a member of the Axis of Evil. Now, all the contacts we've had with Iranians over the past several years have suggested that increasingly they believe there's a common purpose there. They support the Karzai government as reluctantly as we do. They are against the Taliban but realize they have to deal with them inside the country. They would like help in trying to control transporter drug trafficking. They realize that the problems in northern Pakistan have presented in the last couple of years an increasingly terrible experience with regard to al-Qaeda, whom they oppose. And they have basically said that they would work with this. And I think probably Suzanne's right that it's so urgent for them, it's almost enough to think that they would do that whether we make a deal on nuclear. If there's going to have to be a new election in Afghanistan, and there's going to have to be a loya jirga to sort of authorize a new form of election. It probably can't be done without Iran. So there's so many things we have in common in Afghanistan that renewing that discussion, I think, is very important.
Good. Abner.
Yeah, just two brief points. I like the idea of my colleague from the left. I think it's very much unfeasible. I think that Iran would never truly accept that, and I think it's part of the Iran rhetoric. I think they would use it to kill time and to waste time, but truly they would never be interested in that because it's deprived them from what they believe is their own right to do enrichment. They believe that they are entitled to that.
They say they will accept it.